over U.S. history. And we'll have a special emphasis on how those rights changed because they used other rights to change them. So, for example, you'll see things about people gaining the right to vote. We'll try and focus on what rights they used to actually gain the right. Let's start off with the women's rights movement. So our objective is to describe historical roles of women and how they were able to gain voting rights in the 20th century. So we're going to look at some examples of women who were trying to gain the right to vote as our example for the women's rights movement. And our essential question is, how did women's role in society change between the 19th and 20th centuries? So you'll see through this lesson that in the very beginning, women were perceived or seen as one way in the United States, and as you go through the lesson, you'll see how that. So how were women seen in the early days of the United States? Women were seen as people who were supposed to take care of a house, essentially. They called it a woman's sphere, which meant like where she's supposed to be and what she's supposed to have influence over. And her sphere was confined to or limited to her house. And it was argued that women were supposed to stay in a house because the rest of the world was too cruel for them. Her role was to take care of that house and to civilize her husband and her family and make them ready for the world. Or if she had daughters, it was her role to civilize them and make them ready to also take care of a house one day. So that's how women were seen in the early years, as caretakers, essentially. People that were in charge of a house. In that role, they were supposed to not only take care of the house, but take care of their family and make them acceptable citizens. What were their rights like? Or what were their rights not like? You're going to see that they didn't have certain rights. Well, they couldn't make wills, they couldn't sign a contract, and they couldn't sue anyone in court unless their husband said it was okay. They also could not vote. They had the legal status of a minor, which meant if they were accused of a crime or did something not the same rights as a kid. If they were single, they could own their own property, but once they became married, they had no control over their property or their children. So, for example, let's say you're a woman living in 1830 and you own a chair. Maybe you bought that chair. That is your chair, as long as you were single. But if you got married, that chair would technically now belong to your husband. It would be his property, and he would be able to say what happens to the chair. They also, this is a big one, they also could not initiate divorce, meaning that if the relationship between the husband and wife was strained in some way, the woman could not be the one to try to end that marriage or initiate the divorce. So think about all the negatives of that. If a woman was maybe in an abusive relationship, she could not legally end that relationship or that marriage because it was not legal for a woman to initiate divorce. The husband had to do it. So what is all of that? Conference, Elizabeth Ann read that they wrote it and made it look a lot like the Declaration of Independence. And then and women. So instead of it just saying all men are created equal and all men what were they trying to do? They were trying to get state by state for women to vote passed in states. And they even tried for a constitution. It usually is kind of being the beginning of the modern women's rights movement. But because slavery was going on at this time, slavery was kind of the big thing that a lot of these women. So in the late 1800s, so much later after the Seneca Falls Convention, Susan B. Anthony, who you've probably heard of, tried several times to introduce an amendment bill for women's suffrage, or letting women be able to vote. But it was always killed in the Senate, which meant they just kept shooting down the idea for it. So how did they get that changed? They used their rights. Like you see in these pictures, you can see women exercising their rights. I know they just look like they're dressed in funny clothes. What they're doing is they're protesting. They're using their right to petition, their right to assembly, and their freedom of speech to talk about how they think they should have the right to vote. So did it work? Yes. Much later, 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention. Think about that. 70 years is an incredibly long time. But eventually it happened. As people started to see the dedication of women, especially during World War I, which was going on at the time, and marches and protests and hunger strikes and all kinds of things that they were doing to try and get people's attention about their right to vote. They won the right to vote. And you can see the wording of it, of the 19th Amendment in black text there. It says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." It's a fancy way of saying it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you can vote in the United States, and nobody can take that right away from you. So that's just a brief history of something that was done for women to gain a right. So what you saw in this lesson was you saw at the beginning how women were treated and seen, perceived in the United States. You saw that kind of change because of things women tried to do to change that. They had the Seneca Falls Convention. They wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. They protested. They did all these things to try and gain a right that they have today. That's all for the lesson. If you have any questions, please reach out. Please make sure you answer the questions that are underneath of this video before you exit. If you don't have any questions,